Ayubowan, Vanakkam, Assalamu Alaikum. On behalf of AmCham Sri Lanka, let me take this opportunity to thank you for taking the time to join us and to say we hope you and your loved ones remain safe and unaffected by this awful pandemic. There's no doubt that the situation that is upon us is absolutely unprecedented. Global numbers of those affected are closing in on the 2 million mark, and here in Sri Lanka, the last 5 days alone have seen a rise in 86 patients. There is no doubt that until an effective vaccine is found, COVID-19 will be an undeniable part of our lives. And although to some extent, both businesses and we as individuals have in the past 5 to 6 weeks had our heads, well, pretty much half buried in the sand, taking day-to-day mitigation and survival measures, the reality is upon us and we need to start playing for the long game. Here at AmCham Sri Lanka, we have curated a series of Knowledge Hub webinars which we will be bringing to you weekly over the next several weeks, and we hope that the topics we focus on, as well as the insights from our eminent panels on those subjects, will help you in your planning toward business continuity and repurposing in the medium and long term. Before I introduce our topic and our panel for this morning, I just want to remind each of you out there that prevention and recovery is quite literally in our hands. So stay home and save lives. Today at this AmCham Sri Lanka Knowledge Hub webinar series in collaboration with Cemex HRM, we'll be talking about what we have termed the Covid-19 Labour Conundrum. With the global economy contracting at this unprecedented rate, it is an unfortunate fact that words like pay cuts, layoffs, furloughs, and cutbacks are becoming a necessity. The ILO just a few days ago said they estimate the COVID-19 could result in the loss of as many as 195 million jobs worldwide. Here in Sri Lanka, many of the larger organizations such as Brandix, Sri Lankan Airlines, and SoftLogic, to name a few, have already announced cutbacks across the board in their attempts of preemptive action. And as we meander into our second month of lockdown right here, we felt it would be prudent to better understand this conundrum. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel of experts. We have with us this morning Ms. Dinusha Jayamanne. She's the Director HR of Frontiera Brands for Sri Lanka and the Indian subcontinent. Dinusha's experience spans over 16 years in the human resource management sector, specializing in a range of HR and change leadership roles. She's an attorney at law, holds an MBA from the University of Western Sydney, and is an SHRM Senior Certified Professional. Dinusha is the Vice President, Professional Development for the Association of Human Resource Professionals. Next, we have Rohan Dunuwille. Rohan is a senior attorney at law and partner at Equitas Legal, and one of his areas of expertise is arbitration, employment law, human resources, industrial relations, and construction law. You may recall the article analyzing the prevalent labor laws that we shared via our bulletin board a couple of weeks ago, which was written by Rohan. And for those of you who may have missed that or want to see that document, I've already posted the link on the chat tab. You can take a look at it from there. Joining us from the EFC, we have Director General CEO Kanishka Weerasinghe, an experienced specialist in the fields of industrial relations and employment in the country. Mr. Weerasinghe is the 11th Director General of the EFC and is credited with having handled a broad spectrum of industrial issues for different sectors, including plantations over the years. He is an attorney at law and holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Colombo. He also has associated qualifications and has received executive education at the National University of Singapore. Last but certainly not least, your moderator for this morning's session, EXCO member and chairman, Talent Subcommittee, Joint Apparel Association Forum, Mr. Yohan Lawrence. Yohan is a past chairman of the Sri Lanka Apparel Exporters Association and a manufacturing sector veteran with close upon 2 decades in the apparel sector. He holds a master's degree from Middlesex University. I am your host and facilitator for this morning's session on behalf of AmCham Sri Lanka, Rai Raymond. Without further ado, Yohan, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. Welcome, everybody. I just want to do a quick check and make sure you can hear me. One of my panelists can give me a wave and say you can hear me. That'll be fine. Yeah. Thank you, Rohan. So what I thought I'd start off with was just to give you guys a perspective from an apparel background. So from the supply side, the COVID-19 hit us really from about the end of February. So basically, almost overnight with the shutdown in China, there was an immediate cessation on the raw material sources out of China. So companies had all gone away for Chinese New Year, and we were expecting them to be back in work by the end of February, or it starts shipping by the end of February, early March. And then with the shutdown, we then had an issue where we had a block on raw material. At this point, COVID-19 had not really reached the shores of our customers in the US and the EU. So our main worry at the time was the ability to deliver into customers against orders. And at that point in early March, we estimated that the direct hit to Sri Lanka from loss of apparel exports would be in the region of $500 million. Our main challenge was really going to be trying to catch back when supply started out of China, and we had then started conversations with the authorities in terms of looking for relaxation on work overtime limits in terms of May and June and so on, when we were hoping to get back into production. We also saw a silver lining at the time in that we felt that our customers who were also buying out of China would realize the reliance on the source, and that there might be a positive side for us in the longer term in terms of business moving in. As we went into March, the situation obviously started deteriorating very fast as COVID-19 affected not just Sri Lanka, but also our customers. We then saw the majority of our customers either cancelling existing orders, putting them on hold, saying that they wanted to evaluate the situation. So across the board, buyers basically said, if you've shipped it, we don't want it. If it's in fabric form, don't cut it. If it's cut, don't stitch it. If it's stitched, don't sew it, etc. So pretty much put the full brakes on it. And as we also know, then also said, by the way, where we used to pay you in 60 days, we now pay you in 90 and so on. So at that point, the crisis really started, the scale of it really started coming home to head. And we felt that the total, sorry, there was, there was just a comment from somebody about sharing a screen. I'm not sure that that's possible. I think participants should be able to see me. I'm not using a presentation, guys. I'm just talking. So I just wanted to, so we then felt that the loss of revenue to the industry would really be closer to $2 billion for the year. So we are a $5.3, $5.4 billion industry, and we feel that for the current year, 2021, we will lose up to about $2 billion. More importantly, in terms of the job front, our current estimates say that we will lose between 100 to 115, 120,000 jobs. To put that in perspective, that's about a third of the workforce. Bangladesh has 4.1 million people, I think, and they've already made 1 million people redundant. The latest estimates from the ILO, I think, is a total of something over around 2.5 million job losses. It's a massive figure the ILO has given. So, having said that, it isn't doom and gloom, and we feel this will pass. The industry has survived a lot of hits over the last few years, and we're confident that with the right measures, we will be able to take that. In terms of the local context, we know the actions taken by companies, not just in apparel, but particularly all our bigger companies as well. Pay cuts, freezing of non-essential expenditure, putting capital expenditure on hold, and so on. On the people front, most companies have paid salaries for March, but particularly for companies in the SME sector, those employing probably under about 1,000 people, the ability to pay salaries in April is in question. These guys simply do not have the money because they operate very much on their cash flow is much tighter, and since the middle of March, they haven't had any business, and therefore they have had no revenue. So that gives us one of our biggest challenges, I think, from an HR perspective. And the conundrum, as I see it, is this: the industry doesn't want to exit. We don't want to close. That's not in the interest of any of the stakeholders to have that sort of outcome. That said, there is a new norm, and the new norm that's coming up is going to be a constriction on demand. So demand is going to be less, and there is going to be the need to restructure our industries in order to be able to face the challenges that come across. Within that, we have the framework of our labor laws, and I know that's the part of the conversation that most people want to pick up on, because we want to be able to protect businesses. We want to be able to protect as many jobs as possible, but we have to have the flexibility that we need in the labor laws to allow us to do this restructuring whilst holding the core business secure. So just in order to put some frame context to this, I will put up a quote from an ILO report which was out just today actually, so apologies for the format of it, but I think it captures the essence of the conundrum. I can't see it up on screen, but I hope it is. I'll read it out, and this is from the ILO. We do not know how long it will be until the demand for garments return. In what form, scope, and scale garment value chains will resume operations, and when manufacturing may resume in safe working conditions. We know that many manufacturers in the industry are not resilient to survive this crisis. Factories are already beginning to close and workers are being laid off and furloughed. We must act to protect workers and employers during this period so that manufacturers remain viable and able to bring workers back into work during the recovery. I saw that this morning and I felt that really captured the essence of the conundrum of where we stand at the moment. So that said, I hope I've given some context to the topic. I will now hand over to Rohan, who will then outline the legal aspects and give us some practical solutions we can take.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody is staying safe. Picking up from where Lawrence left off, we have faced unprecedented times. There is no doubt about it. Every industry is aware of it globally as well as in Sri Lanka. Just to give you a little background to our labor legislation and employment and industrial relations legislation, at the moment we have something like over 30 or 32 statutes in place. It is important to understand that a vast number of these pieces of legislation were passed on the basic assumption or principle that employers and employees are at unequal bargaining positions. Thereupon, the legislature took it upon themselves to pass legislation to protect the interests of the employees in most instances. That is what we see today in the majority of the statutes that are out there at the moment, and which I have addressed in my write-up that I did for AmCham some time back. Now, for example, just to give you a quick rundown, we all know that employees are hired by companies, individuals, partnerships, etc., on some sort of a contract. It may be oral or written. Majority of the contracts in today's context are written contracts, but the Industrial Disputes Act of 1950 gives power to the labor court to disregard a contract or certain terms of a contract if it is of the view that those terms or the entirety of the contract is unfair. That is a very subjective discretion given to the labor court. Now, this has changed to a certain degree in 2011 when the Supreme Court, Justice Iva Vanasundara to be exact, if I'm not mistaken, held that the general principles of contract will and should apply for industrial employment contracts as well. Therefore, the normal principles of contract of offer and acceptance and consideration, etc., would be applicable. Now, this is a slight change from where we are, and however, that principle, as far as I'm aware, has not really taken hold, with the majority of the statutes being administered by the Commissioner General of Labour. I say that because the majority of the statutes that we will be discussing at some point in time are governed and has empowered the Commission of Labour to take certain decisions, actions to safeguard the interest of parties. When I say parties, employers and employees both. It is a mechanism that has been put in place and with wide powers being granted to the commissioner to prosecute employers, for example, for non-payment of wages, provident fund, gratuity, etc. The Industrial Disputes Act is a fairly unique piece of legislation, again administered by the Commissioner General of Labour. Vast powers are given to the Commissioner to resolve disputes between parties. For example, while a conciliatory role is played by the Commissioner in most instances, if a dispute remains unresolved, the Commissioner has the power to refer such disputes to the Minister of Labour, who in turn can refer such disputes to industrial arbitrations for resolution. I will not get into the nitty-gritties of it because it's a discussion on its own. However, just to highlight and place before you the authority given to the Commissioner in ordinary running of businesses and managing employer-employee disputes. Now, this is so far worked fairly well because we have never faced this kind of a situation before. Now, this is where the Commissioner and the Minister must necessarily step in to balance out the equities. To be quite frank, the law does not support pay cuts unless under very strict conditions, furloughs, laying off again under strict conditions, or temporary measures to be adopted by an employer, maybe a small shop to ranging to a blue chip company. They don't differentiate as to who can do what. This is where we face this particular roadblock in light of the fact that changes need to be made and made fast. We all know companies are reducing salaries. We all know companies are stopping allowances, asking employees to stay at home and not pay them, or furloughs as we know it. It's already happening. It's a common factor. Now, the issue is whether we are legally entitled to do that or whether there are any provisions in law that provide for it. In terms of the law, all of the above, subject to certain conditions, are not permitted in law. So, an employer is to ask me today whether I can reduce salaries because I have no business. That is not something an employer can do. He will be in violation of the Shop and Office Employees Act, for example. The seriousness of this is purely because directors become personally liable in terms of most employment statutes. When I say personally liable, notwithstanding the financial positions of companies, the employees, the directors of companies, etc., partners in a firm or sole proprietors can be prosecuted in the magistrate's court in their personal capacity. For example, we have provisions in the Companies Act number 7 of 2007 to wind up a company. Creditor can go to court and say, company X is unable to pay its debts, so we want to wind up the company. Companies can resolve on its own to wind up the company. In such a situation, a liquidator will be appointed who will get into the shoes of the directors, take charge of the business, ascertain the liabilities, sell off the assets, etc., to pay the creditors. And in the event the assets are less than the liabilities of that company, the creditors will have to bear their own losses. It stops there. There is no penal sanction on the directors unless, of course, they have deliberately funneled out money, etc. So the general law is that it stops there. The directors can't be touched thereafter. The Industrial Disputes Act and other laws connected to employment law have an overriding power and a preference even in the Companies Act. I say that because in terms of the 9th schedule of the Companies Act, you have the preferential claims by which a liquidator will settle the debts. There are approximately, bear with me for a moment, 5 out of the 9 being employee or employment related payments. So preference is given even at that stage to settle the liabilities of employees. So it is in these circumstances where we as a nation has put a lot of emphasis on protecting employees. The question arises whether adequate legislation is in place to protect and safeguard the businesses. I know Kanishka will speak on this as well. After much persuasion in 2003, thanks to the efforts of the Employers Federation, the Termination Act, or the TEVA as we fondly refer to it, brought in a formula whereby the employers or the companies would in the least know what their liability will be, what their exposure will be in the event of a closure of a business. Prior to that, the entire discussion was with the Commissioner General of Labour. The Commissioner had the discretion to decide whether a company could be shut down, and if so, what sort of a compensation package each company must pay its employees. So that discretion of the compensation formula has now been taken out. However, the discretion still remains with the Commissioner as to whether to permit a company to close down or not. So it is in this context that we must look at the statutes that are before us. And unfortunately, there is no provision other than seeking approval from the Commissioner for these various short-term measures that each company is looking to employ now. So I think I'll hand over to Yohan from that point. I think we'll need to get into the discussion of the individual statutes maybe a little later on.
Thank you, thank you, Rohan. I think that was a very clear insight, and I agree. The issue here that we have is that Sri Lanka's laws are based around giving a lot of protection to employees, but these are not normal times that we live in, and how we manage through is, I think, going to be our challenge. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to Dinusha, who will give us her perspective from an HR front. Dinusha, over to you.
Thank you, Yohan. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to connect with all of you. So like what my colleagues mentioned, I think that these have been unprecedented times, and industries across Sri Lanka are faced with multiple unique challenges and have been taking steps to, circumvent these that in a manner that could work for each industry. So these include pretty drastic measures from a people perspective, which are not ideal, but had to be done in the given circumstances. So over the last few weeks, I've been hearing a lot of criticism from different people with regard to some of these practices, and also leadership being branded as good or bad. My perspective is that every leader has the best of intentions for their businesses, and it's just that where individual businesses are at, steps needs to be taken to survive and pass through the storm. So some businesses have had double whammies from a supply and demand perspective, and this has affected their cash flows and are unable to have the same OPEX as before. So this also depends on the cost structure of the organization. Like what Yohan said, I think 70% if you take apparel, for instance, 70% of their total cost is people. So hence, in an industry like that, curtailing costs with regard to people is essential for sustenance. So it's just that when you get into a situation like that, one needs to take due care and diligence and have a very well thought through change management program, which you get the buy-in of your people managers or your people leaders and implement it across the company. So this is different in less labor-intensive industries, and cutting down on people cost might not be the primary result. Like, for instance, at Fonterra, we've not taken any pay cuts or benefit cuts or layoffs. But what we have been trying to do is to maintain a healthy cash flow. How do we really operate the business, and while keeping in mind the health and safety of our people, the food safety of our products, and ensuring that the products are available to our consumers across the country. Although, and I'd like to give a slightly different perspective, is that predictions of COVID-19 is to bring about the worst economic downturn, I think the Great Depression, since that despite the uncertainty, businesses can explore opportunities to carve out new ways of working. So as they say, necessity breeds innovation, right? And this would help Sri Lankan industries to really chart out a new course and a transformative path forward. So what I thought I'll do is I'll share with you a few areas which businesses or business leaders can really think about from a people perspective, and I'd like to actually outline 5. The first being, how do you create an organization where people is first priority? So if you noticed, I think a pleasing development in the country over the last few weeks has been the heightened awareness with regard to people safety and also related business continuity plans. So there's a clear opportunity in Sri Lanka to institutionalize health and safety policies and practices and have comprehensive structures. So that's a clear opportunity. Secondly, how do we be fit for purpose but yet future ready? Because this future fit for purpose term is rather cliched, but I think staying efficient across the value chain is absolutely necessary. So since instead of looking at arbitrary cuts, if companies can really focus on using this opportunity and conducting comprehensive org design reviews across your company, looking at proper job analysis, it can really lead to understanding where duplications lie, where spans of control are suboptimal, and understand the depth of layers in your business, which will create better line of sight and which will enable better decision making. And also with regard to business recovery, I think there is articles and all sorts of talk about what shape this recovery is going to take place, whether it's a U, a V, or a L, whatever form it takes or whatever shape it takes, I mean, businesses will recover, I think, as Yohan also mentioned earlier. But what matters is how ahead are you in that recovery curve? Where is your business? Are you ready to pick up when demand does pick up? So it's important to have your people ready and equipped to be able to face the future. So this can be in the form of really transforming your organization through introducing new ways of working, exploring digitization opportunities, which will essentially equip your talent to really stay ahead of the game. So thirdly, it's also about an opportunity about building a new capability landscape. I mean, COVID has imposed new areas which will really test us from a functional and leadership capability perspective. So one such example is, if you really look at Sri Lanka and our distribution, we've been pretty much on a brick and mortar game. But now you see that e-commerce is really on the rise, and it will assume a significant role in the value chain where organizations will need to be equipped and geared to be able to handle it. So how do you really drive your people? And I just gave just one example. How do you drive your people to acquire new skills which will be in this this new norm of operating in the future that we never thought before? And also from a leadership perspective, these are really trying times, and this is a real opportunity to allow your people to put their leadership skills to the test, and you can do that by providing them with bigger, better responsibilities, and those who really display situational agility and drive high performance in your teams will really be the winners for the future. And this can provide greater visibility of the depth of your bench, and will be a far more accurate assessment rather than the regular talent assessments that we do in our organizations. So I'm on to my fourth point, which is really to explore the future of work. This is a favorite topic of mine. So the gig economy, the alternate workforce is going to, or is anticipated to grow in Sri Lanka post COVID. And unfortunately, as I think Yohan also mentioned, there's going to be a lot of unemployment in the country as a result of it. So that plus the emergence of new job types is going to lead to a increase in this gig workers. So how can organizations really look at an opportunity to resort to giggers and different alternate workforce models in your companies, which will really allow you to have a really good flexible workforce? I see that as a clear opportunity. And finally, and I think most importantly, I think post-COVID, there is going to be a renewed mission of life, right, for people and organizations. So we are being challenged to rethink of our collective and individual responsibilities to one another, to the organizations that we work for, and to the environment and country at large. So how can organizations build agility around purpose, sustainability, and governance, and embed this into ways of working is, I think, something that we can all think about and do. So finally, so to sum up, all I can say is that when this is all over, trails will be waiting, and let's together build our organizations, future-proof our talent for future, and also build a better Sri Lanka. So that's it from me, and over to Yohan.
Thank you, Dinusha, and apologies. I think there was a little bit of issues with your camera, but I think most of us got that. I think the key takeaway from that is this idea of every leader does what they do in the best interest of the business. And I think that comes back to my point earlier in that saying, I don't think anybody is in this to say, yeah, we want to close, yeah, we want to exit. That's a different conversation. But obviously each business is different. Labor component is different from one to another, and so on. Circumstances are different. But I think you're absolutely right, is that at this point, it's the interest of the leader is in terms of protecting that business and the employees that are within it. So I'll now, there are a number of questions. I think Rohan's presentation has got a lot of interest. We'll come to those at the end, but I'll now ask Kanishka to give us his take on the position and what is possible, what is not possible. So Kanishka, if you want to take it up. It's muted, Kanishka, your end. Kanishka, you there? I think Kanishka is having a bit of difficulty with his connection. Kanishka, can you hear me? Rohan, and whilst Kanishka comes back on, can we just, one of the questions that has come up is in terms of this conversation about salary cuts and what is possible and not possible.
Yeah.
Kanishka, you there?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Kanishka, fine. So we'll hand over to you to take it from there. We'll come back to the questions.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much, AmCham, for inviting me for this program. Oh. Jeez.
Can hear you, Kanishka, carry on.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me for this program. And I would like to start by saying, well, the world has been turned topsy-turvy, and it will not be the same world of work that we will be going into when we resume. I need to sort of forewarn you on that, because all of you know that this is a health issue, and quite apart from the impact of the COVID virus on the businesses at present, when we resume, we'll also have to take certain precautions. We'll have to give health and safety foremost priority. Also, we need to understand that utilization of employees or human capital will have to be done in a way that we take into account the health issue, right? So that at least for in the short to mid term. That is what everyone is talking about, as you know. And if you look at the impact of the COVID virus on our economy, it is devastating. And but there is some hope, but it has been severe, because already our economy was not in the best shape, as you know, but we had some potential to grow this year, especially this year, in a number of sectors. And that potential is still there. That's the plus. But having said that, our economic growth has been downgraded to 2% or less this year, and the world is looking at a depression. That is what the world economists are talking about today. So we need to take this into account to understand the gravity of the situation and to understand that things will not be normal as we go on. Now, what did the COVID virus and the imposition of curfews do to the contract of employment? The contract of employment, which is mainly governed by common law, and also there are statutes, as Rohan mentioned, was actually technically suspended due to the inability of companies to offer work and for employees to come to work because of this situation. And what is important to understand is that this temporary suspension, right, was due to the fact that it was something beyond the control of employers. Of course, here again, the common law dictates that we have a contract of employment, and if it's a monthly contract of employment, we are bound to pay salaries for the month and not for the day. And that is why such legal obligations are not there. If somebody had a contract of employment where you paid them daily, there's no obligation for them to come to work and for you to offer work and pay. But in the case of monthly contracts of employment, which in the majority contracts that we have, there is obligation to pay. These are some of the basic principles, and as Rohan mentioned, there are statutes which say that once you agree to pay a wage, you cannot deduct wages without the consent of employees, because these are authorized deductions. And even in respect of earnings, you have to, which are part of the contractual obligations, you need to revisit the contract, and then parties have to mutually agree if you are to vary. That is absolutely right. Now, what this situation has done to those contracts is, these contracts are continuing. Many of these contracts of employment are continuing, but still the ability of employers, most employers, to offer work has been depleted to a great extent. Some can't offer work actually. 70% of the businesses today are closed and they cannot operate. Only a few are operating, again at a very low scale. So then what happens? What is the situation? Because the law doesn't, as Rohan said, most of the laws in this country are protectionist oriented, at least for employment related matters, are protectionist oriented, and there's no place for employers to go and argue based on those laws in the current and set out the current conditions. So technically, that is why we say, and there's a lot of argument about this and suggestions saying that we may have to suspend the operation of certain laws. Now in India, if you look at our neighbor India, 52 of the employment laws have been suspended, frozen for the moment. And this includes even the Termination Act provisions where compensation has to be paid for lower income grades, because unlike in Sri Lanka, India, only the lower income grades are covered by the Termination Act. So 52 of these laws have been temporarily frozen, because they know that the normal contracts of normal laws relating to employment will have no place actually in this type of situation. It's a global pandemic. This is the first time, not first time, we understand that this situation has not taken place for the last century or so. So it's something totally new. And what we need to understand is that we need to assess situations on a monthly. I don't think we can plan. Of course, businesses have to plan. They have to get ready to get orders and things like that, what are possible. But with regard to the world of work, reality is that we will have to assess and then come up with plans to resume work almost on a monthly basis. But of course, planning for a better revival, because thanks to, and I'm not making a political statement here, but thanks to the efforts by the government, we have been able to curtail the spread of the virus to a great extent, even during the community infection space, and also take a lot of precautions to through quarantine measures and all of that, to ensure that the disease doesn't spread, the virus doesn't spread. And we need to support the government then and follow health instructions when we resume work. And this will I'll come to the next area. This will put a lot of pressure on us when we resume work as to how we plan on utilizing human resources or human capital. We know that we will not be able to bring in all the workers as we did, or employees as we did before. Even officers will have to operate at 50% the most, or even less in capacity. Manufacturing, correct me if I'm wrong, Yohan, the BOI guidelines and the health guidelines are to operate for the moment with skeletal staff, but I don't think you will be able to bring in more than 1/3 of employees, right? At the moment?
At the moment, so I think it depends on where in the country you are. Certainly, if you are in what they designate as the red zones, the restrictions are tighter. From a manufacturing perspective, factories outside are now able to go up to 50%.
Yeah.
But that is dependent on the approval of the PHI/MOH, who have the final say. So currently, if a company is wanting to operate, they need to apply formally through the BOI or the EDB, depending on which sector they come under. But the actual approval is then taken offline and done by the MOH or the PHIs of the area.
The point is, we have to keep social distancing even during when we work in offices as well as the manufacturing sectors. And you know how manufacturing in some cases, you keep all those machines in, that will be a thing that we will not be able to follow in the future. So we have to keep social distancing at every stage. We have to have very high levels of OSH capacity and sanitization, right? And that's again going to add to your cost, by the way, right? How you operate. But the biggest problem right now is the lack of working capital and income. Many companies have zero income, right? Very few have some streams coming in. Now, even in the apparel sector, I'm told that creditors who had 30 to 60-day credit facilities are now asking for 120. And they are, in addition to that, they are also in a dilemma, not only the apparel sector, most industries, because their foreign clients are claiming force majeure situations. That means they want to avoid payments. So there's going to be a huge pressure on income. So working capital will be less. So this is why I think, I mean, no one wants to have a revision of contracts at, I mean, no one will want to have it, but it will be necessary, a necessary evil to revisit contracts of employment, collective agreements, and all these work arrangements that we have today, because it will be very difficult for us to operate otherwise. That is reality, and that is why companies are taking these measures in a way that, and Rohan mentioned that, you know, these can be taken subject to conditions, and that is the consent of employees. I think a great many employees have also realized the gravity of the situation, and I'm happy to say, at least in Sri Lanka, majority of the employees are going on the basis that we will try to save as many jobs as possible, try to save as many livelihoods as possible, and that's a huge governance principle that you are adhering to even in this difficult time. So I'm actually I'm actually proud to say I'm part of an organization where my membership, and I know that there are a lot of other employers who are walking that talk of good governance. It is absolutely difficult. Some may have to retrench, some may have to let go certain categories, but they're trying to keep employees and their wage bill afloat, right? And they're trying to keep afloat, and also they are trying to keep the wage bill going, because they are also mindful that the economy will not function if there's no consumption and spending. So there the private sector has an onus, and that is why we have also been asking for various stimulus packages from the government. There have been 3 packages so far, but I believe there will have to be more, because if the situation does not improve, and I sincerely hope it will, beyond May and June, working capital reserves will anyway be depleted again, right? So the reality will be that the employer's ability to pay wages will diminish from period to period. That is why it's very important for us to understand that economic activities have to commence, and yes, we have the onus to have OSH safeguards and all of that, sanitation conditions. But what the employees also have to understand is that they need to come to work and support the economic activities of and business activities of their employer, because without that they can't expect to be paid. I don't think there can be an expectation to pay if there's no income. And if we want to avoid a worst case scenario, here I'm actually thinking of a worst case scenario of mass retrenchments like what's happening in other parts of the world, we need to start economic activity, yes, under restricted conditions because of the health issue, but we need to do that soon. So that is why I think we need to look at the reality of the issue. Yes, there's a health condition, we need to understand that, and they are also warning of a second wave which some countries have already faced. We need to take precautions, but let's not forget the fact that our country and businesses have been resilient for the last 30 to 40 years because of the war and also because of various other factors. The war, I know it's very painful to go back and look at those things, but we were very resilient. We were very conservative as a result. Yes, sometimes more conservative than other risk-taking countries, but we survived one of the most difficult eras ever, right? And we took precautions. Now, I took this example at another webinar recently. Can you recall that some of us didn't go in the same vehicle as our spouse? If we had 2 kids, either of us would take them separately. I mean, I know that these are painful but realistic solutions that we took. So we will have to look at the health issues as in the same way. We'll have to take precautions. We'll have to wear masks, gloves. I mean, we look like aliens at work, but work has to go on. Economic activity cannot come to a standstill. So wherever economic activity is commencing, globally as well as locally, I think we need to support those situations fully. Otherwise, there will be issues with regard to working capital, how we deploy human resources, as well as they lead to other socio-economic issues. That's on the macro scale. Coming down to what our colleagues from the world of work were mentioning about work arrangements and things like that. Am I taking too long, Yohan?
No, I think we have a couple of minutes.
Yohan, am I taking too long?
No, that's fine. Carry on, Kanishka. You have a couple of minutes. Couple of minutes more.
Sorry.
Please go ahead, Kanishka. No problem at all. You can go ahead.
Yeah. Just to say that now we need to now come to the real, nuts and bolts situations. How are we going to deploy? A lot of you were talking about working from home. Yes, that's a huge plus, and companies that don't have infrastructure will have to provide infrastructure, because this is becoming reality. Because if you are going to have 50% of the workforce not coming to work, you might want to sort of give assignments to them so that they can do from home. Then and also e-commerce and things like that. I mean, there are other industries that are going to come up and boom. So, but coming back to the work arrangements, things like job sharing will be a common factor. Part-time work will be a common factor. And the moment you talk about job sharing, that will also lead to a situation where, well, if the employer can afford it, I suppose they will pay the full wages. But if there are long periods of non-work, especially I'm talking about the manufacturing sector, we will have to think of various other means. That's why we have proposed, for example, to the Commissioner General and the task force to allow employers to temporarily keep employees at home and pay a living wage or 50% of the wage or the minimum national minimum wage. This is becoming a reality. And also for certain other industries like the hospitality industry, which cannot afford anything, perhaps we can even propose that we pay an allowance which does not attract EPF, ETF for the long periods of non-work. Remember, this is a situation where we are keeping the employees on our payroll. That means gratuity, all of that will have to be provided, but they will not come to work because hotel sector, I don't think they will be able to start fully during the season. Some are talking about the hotel sector recovery going beyond February. Sanat Ukwata mentioned this. He is the chairman of the TASL. So this is reality. I think we need to approach situations. Unfortunately, wherever revisions have to be made in salaries, and I mean, people use the term pay cuts, right? Deductions with regard to certain other benefits will be a reality, because remember, on the other side, the reciprocal obligation, I mean, remember, the employee is committing to your job security, right? In other countries, they just allow them to be retrenched, right? Here, we are not looking at a scenario like that. We are being very responsible. We are trying to ensure that retrenchment is the last resort, right? So on that note, I'll just sum up some of the issues that, but I'll share one slide with you, which might be interesting for you to understand what we have been proposing. I think, Rohan, you're privy to this. This particular slide, which we have proposed to the Minister of Labour in terms of the task force. These are some of the immediate relief that we have sought. We have sought the delayed remittance of the employer portion of EPF, and ETF is anyway employer, without having to pay surcharges up to about 3 to 6 months. First, initially 3 months, and then maybe if the situation is going to be worse, up to about 6 months. The delay of the remittance of the employer contribution. I don't think we can hold back the employee contribution, but 15% of the payroll is a big amount at hand for an employer who does not have working capital. I know that there are a lot of stimulus packages which have given loans and things like that, but if you look at those conditions, not all employers are eligible or have access to those packages. So, and many of them are stretched. They are on overdrafts, maybe triple overdrafts, and their credit facilities are almost frozen. So in a situation like that, having 15% of the payroll with you, at least for some time, will give you confidence to pay wages and other important commitments with regard to employment. Then we have also asked for the dispensing of the process related to inquiries in case of temporary layoffs, not retrenchments, but temporary non-employment. Again, as Rohan mentioned, Section 2 of the Termination Act applies, and you have to either get the consent of the employee or go before the commissioner for his sanction, even for temporary layoffs. So what we are trying to encourage is to ask the government that to cut short the red tape and not have inquiries, and we have had favorable response to the first two issues already. So that's a huge plus for us. But we are still waiting for another proposal that we have made to reduce salaries when we are laying off temporarily. That means people are not coming to work, they are at home, and that is also being considered by the authorities right now. Then a third one, which concerns employers, was how do you cover up work during curfew? Technically, the employment contract is suspended, but common law says pay salaries for the monthly paid. then how do you cover work? And this proposition was made to the Commissioner General and the Minister of Labour recently, and there was also consensus amongst the fair amount of consensus amongst the unions that as long as they are agreed with these arrangements, agreed with the Commissioner, with the employees, they may be able to say whether this can be a general directive, because not all places are unionized, and also getting sometimes, I mean, we need general directions to work beyond working hours without having to pay overtime and things like that, to place work during holidays and weekends without having to pay those additional payments, which is otherwise becomes a burden on employers. And we need to catch up and work. Sri Lanka will have to catch up and work as a nation if we are to succeed in our economic objectives, which is important, right? Then we have also asked for, we did not forget the daily paid workers, because daily paid workers also sustain your businesses to a great extent. And we have asked for from the government to pay a grant of 5,000 rupees, which they agreed to day before, right? These are the contract workers who are supplied through the contractors, right? Where, you know, they do maintenance and cleaning and things like that. Currently, the responsibility is with the contractor to pay and keep them in employment. Some contractors have not paid, and there are a lot of issues there. So at least we are happy to see that the government has agreed to pay a 5,000 rupee grant, that grant to be extended to the daily paid workers as well. So these are some of the things that I can tell you at the initial stages. Thank you.
Thanks, Kanishka. Thanks for that very clear one. Whilst you're on, I'll just bring up one thing that has come through. There's a lot of the questions about the legality around pay cuts and so on. I'll come to that. But from a company perspective, where it is necessary for them to implement something like that, what is the EFC's advice to companies in terms of how you would manage that process? Kanishka, you there?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry. So the question was, in terms of where companies have a requirement, they absolutely do need to have some sort of pay cut and so on. What would the advice to be to the company side of that? We will come back to the employers in a second, but for a company who has to do that, what is the advice that the EFC would give?
As Rohan said, our common law as well as the statute law says that you have to get the employee consent. So my advice to employers is get the employee consent. But Yohan, we are actually facing a pandemic, and certain decisions cannot be postponed. Because if we postpone a decision to cut and save money so that we can save the livelihoods and jobs of thousands of workers, and if those decisions are not taken on time, that means we'll be facing a situation of retrenchments, maybe half or 1/3 of the workforce. So to avoid that, remember, we are taking those decisions to avoid with us, and also so that they have a livelihood. You see, so the message to companies is that, look, if you have to take those decisions, painful as it is for you as well as the employees, take those decisions. I don't think we have the luxury to delay. And,
I think that's clear.
As you know, can you hear me?
Yeah, just about. It's breaking up, but it's breaking up a little bit, but carry on.
Yeah. As you know, we have also made representations to the Commissioner General to understand, and because labor laws are based on equity. Even if there is a dispute, for instance, with regard to whether we got the consent of 100% employees or not, we'll go to as a dispute and then to an arbitrator. But remember, this is a pandemic we are facing. We are trying to avoid a catastrophe. So I don't expect the Commissioner General or any arbitrator to say roll back a major decision where we have got the majority consent just to accommodate a minority. Let me be very clear about that, because equity is also there on your side for companies. It has to be, because you are trying to avoid a catastrophe. You are trying to avoid mass retrenchments. You're trying to keep your business afloat. This is the argument that we took before the task force, as you know, Yohan, and the Commissioner General of Labour, and you know the response that we got from the Commission. But it doesn't mean that you can have, do it at your discretion. You have to be mindful that we are revising terms and conditions, so get employee consent. Those initial have to be addressed. But if anyone doesn't come back with any response, well, we'll have to take it that there is tacit consent. Right?
Understand. Clear, Kanishka, because I think there's a lot of questions around that, and I'll maybe ask Rohan to pitch in here, because a number of the questions that are coming up, Rohan, is around this issue on consent. What can a company do if the employee consents? Is it legal? If it's not, is it not? So I was just having you flick through the questions, and there's about 5 or 6 that all really.
One matter, Yohan, one matter again I'm emphasizing is we are not. I know that the laws are there, and in a normal situation, if it was a normal situation, we would never even think about going with the concept of majority consent, right? But we need to be mindful that we need to be mindful of the situation that we are facing, right? Faced with. We don't know when we can commence. Some businesses don't know when they can commence business. Some don't know whether they will have the income as they did before. And that is unprecedented. And the world has never come to a standstill, ever.
No, agreed. I think, no, absolutely. I think we always, in normal times, say, gosh, I wish the world would stop turning so I can have a break. And we've all been on a month's break now.
Yeah.
Rohan, your take, Rohan, on the question of salary cuts, deductions, and so on.
Yes. So let me be clear. The law does not provide for unilateral decisions to be made by an employer to stop any sort of benefit that is being paid to an employee as of now. I fully agree with the sentiments shared by Kanishka. While everybody is doing it, doesn't mean it's legal. This is where the commissioner and the minister concerned must take immediate steps to at least issue some sort of guideline till the proper laws are passed or the relevant regulations gazetted, to give some sort of direction to business in general. Everybody is in the dark on this matter so far. We've shut down the country for a little over a month now. And we all know the practical difficulties. I mean, as Kanishka also pointed out, the government has done a huge amount of work to stop the spread. But it's also important to address these issues as well. This is where the commissioner has to step up and take decisive action at this juncture. Like I said before, legal provisions do not provide for arbitrary decisions to be made by employers. Certainly the circumstances warrant such decisions be made, but you run the risk of being prosecuted somewhere down the line. If an employee complains 6 months down the road that my salary was not paid, my overtime was not paid, my provident fund was not paid, is the commissioner not entitled to, or put it better, more clearly, there's an obligation on the commissioner as the administrator of those statutes to prosecute you for non-payment. The commissioner does not have a discretion to say, look, we all went through a pandemic, so I'm not going to enforce the law. There is no discretion given to the commissioner in respect of that. So this is where at least as Kanishka said, in India, there must be some sort of a regulatory process put in place to suspend certain statutes. So that is not happening now. That is where the problem is. I've seen the whole line of questions raised by various people on this webinar. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but the law is very strict on this. There was also a question as to whether an act of God and the rights of parties in respect of a contract. We all know contracts.
Can we throw force majeure into that pot as well? Of
Yes, certainly. So we all know in any contract, if for some supervening event, maybe a commercial contract, an employment contract, any sort of contract, any supervening event outside the control of the parties, the affected party can plead frustration of the contract. That is to say that I am not capable of performing my contract under these laws. We can take up the position similarly in a employment contract such as this. We can say, my business shut down, I have no work to offer you, so please go home, the contract is frustrated. Well and truly good. But this is where the penal sanctions of all these statutes come into play. Though you have done that, the Commissioner General on a complaint made by an employee still can prosecute individual directors. There's personal liability with certain fines being imposed, repayment of money is due, together with jail time. So it's not a simple case of saying, okay, we are all in trouble, let's take a collective decision not to pay anyone. So unless the commissioner is going to give an undertaking that, okay, for the next 6 months, we are going to give a sort of a moratorium, no employee will be prosecuted for any decision they take, obviously within certain conditions and reason. Where do employers stand? This is the burning issue for all employees at this juncture.
Yeah.
Agreed on that. Yeah, and in terms of force majeure,
Yohan, now there are certain provisions in the law for the Commissioner General to give certain relaxations. Now, Section 16 of the EPF Act is one, and that's why we actually asked him for that relief, because that doesn't actually require any amendment to something to the effect that as long as employers have taken responsible measures to ensure that this thing, but the exception is that he will not, for example, impose I'm talking about delays in remitting EPF ETF. If the employer has taken everything possible, and if this is something beyond his control, that's a situation where the commissioner can come in, use his discretion under Section 16, and exempt exempt him from surcharges. Not a moratorium, Rohan. I quite agree with you, but exempt him from surcharges, and that's exactly what we have prayed for. And in view of the fact that there are certain legal issues that we need to cover, that's why we say, look, write to the Commissioner General. Right, Yohan, you were there in some of the following up. I mean, recent discussions that took place. So that's the procedure that we are going to follow. We are going to follow wherever possible, where the commissioner can give it relaxation. We are going to ask for those relaxations until such time a general directive is given as to whether certain laws are to be frozen or not. Now, one of the biggest problems that we have, right? Maybe I'm delaying the questions, is the Termination Act. There's no discretion whatsoever, and the compensation formula is there staring at our face. But we are again trying to see whether we can, and here this is again, that's why we said we have some traction there, to cut off the red tape for temporary non-employment situations. That means temporary layoff. You call it furlough or whatever you call it, but that's a temporary layoff, but the employee remains on the role of the employer's, the check roll, right, for gratuity and things like that. Okay, Yohan.
thank you both for that. Dinusha, I'm keen to get your perspective in terms of from an employee angle. Obviously, as companies deal with these, what would be your view in terms of from an HR perspective? What would be your take on how people can help manage this process?
Yeah, Yohan. So if I just park the legality aside for a moment, I think in organizations, any difficult change that has to be implemented or a difficult decision that has to be implemented will boil down to two things. First would be the employer-employee relationship that you have built over the years. Second is how strong and comprehensive change management program that you have in place. So if I talk of the employer-employee relationship, I think think this is what obviously we always preach as business leaders and HR, that it is a absolutely important thing to build employee engagement within the business, for employees to really understand what the business is striving for from strategic perspective, and what is my functions and my own role in the whole process, so that there is a clear establishment of role clarity as to how, if I bring an analogy into perspective, what brick am I carrying to build the castle, and so that you can map it both ways, and there is very clear established accountability in the organization. So if that is strong, when the business is either doing well or doing bad, the employee will get an understanding of where do I stand and what do I need to do and what is my responsibility, I think, towards the company at large. So I think, as Kanishka was saying, employees also, and I think a lot of companies that have implemented it, I was really happy to hear that employees are of that understanding, and which is great to really understand that I'm actually not being laid off, but maybe my factory is being mothballed for a certain period of time, and I still have my job, but maybe I only get paid to a certain percentage because my employee is going through a difficult time. So I think that employee-employee relationship becomes very key, and how do you really sustain that over this period of time also would be key. Secondly, when it comes to change management programs, and especially when managing this kind of change, which really impacts the pocket of employees and obviously their families and other indirect people that they get associated with, it really hurts people. But I think for anything to be successful of this nature, I think there is a lot of consideration that has been given to the why as to why you are doing it. So the purpose behind it. So if you really start with the why, then people will understand what, and then they get to the how of really doing it. So then it becomes very very concrete, and people believe in the cause as to, and will be with you in the whole process. So I can quote a few really good change management programs that Sri Lankan companies have adopted, I think, over the last couple of weeks. Is that, I think, one, when the communication was done, after the communication, there was a lot of education, I think, across the system, especially in people leaders, in how to really tackle those scenarios. Because what is important is that the communication has to be the same. The communication has to be trickled down so that the last person who hears it also hears the same message that was pretty much sent through the central body. So I know that a lot of companies in Sri Lanka spent great amount of detail in this exercise, in really educating, making known as to what the reasons were behind it, so that every people leader looked after their small teams and ensured that they understood. And on the whole aspect of consent, I mean, we are talking of humans here. So legality can be one thing, but how do you really look at that consent from your employee's perspective with the right reasoning? So with that, and also in ensuring that due care and diligence, as I said before when I was talking, is also extremely important to understand where different people are, where different families are at. And I know that, again, a good example was that when certain people really put forward their difficulties, companies have really gone and done different adjustments, maybe getting banks to really defer their loans, and in certain circumstances where people's repayment to loans had been 50-60% of their base pay. In fact, in some situations, they are right now better off, because for the next 3 to 4 months, companies have requested banks not to get them to, repay. So things like that. And also from a people perspective, I know that in certain levels, at least at maybe junior executive sort of levels, there have been pleas that have been made and also have been considered. So what are those really compromises or make cues that employers can also do by really hearing and having a good, candid, constructive conversation, which can benefit both parties, so that and also explain that this is a time-bound exercise, it's not forever, but make people clear as to what that timeline is, so that people can adjust their expenses to their lifestyles in a certain way that they can come out of it. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dinusha.
Sorry to keep jumping in like this, but Dinusha touched on two very important points. Otherwise, I might be considered as the draconian panelist.
Not at all.
Not so, but you actually, Dinusha, you touched on two very important points, and we, when we advise members, we keep that in mind. One is the people factor. That's the most important one, right? Yes, you are having a difficult time. You have to do these things. These are difficult decisions which cannot be postponed, but in doing so, you need to again come back to your family, as you quite correctly pointed out. Having that discussion with them, getting them to understand is absolutely crucial. So again, this is part of equity, right? This whole issue of, I mean, this is a terrible situation, and this is not a normal situation. We don't revise, that's why I said we don't revise terms and conditions in between employment contracts, right? So that's the first realization that people have to be educated on, and we need to understand that before we go to our employees, right, with this message. So that's one. And you touched on a very another important point, that and this is what I've been telling companies: don't think that you can follow the same strategy that another company followed. You need to understand what is possible in your company, the effect of it on employees and their families, and then do it. So one size fits for all is not a recommendation that I will make, because of the people factor and also the company's ability, right? So that, and the people factor is very important, because after this crisis is over, I mean, here I'm also talking about asking you all to resume work. Who is going to do all that? It's the employees and the people. So we need to have them on board fully, right? So that side also has to be thought of, and again, equity plays a major role there. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I think just before we move on this subject of the pay cuts, because there's been a lot of conversation around it, I think, and Rohan, I'd like an answer here. Is my understanding of the position correct, that if an employee has sat down with his employer, had a conversation and obtained his consent, then from a legal perspective that is valid, or is the employer in breach of anything if he has specific consent of that employer?
Thank you, Yohan. Very pertinent question. Now, by agreement, salaries, etc., can be reduced. That's not a problem. One thing to keep in mind is that in terms of the Employee Provident Fund Act, it's a offence to reduce earnings, which in turn would entail in the reduction of contribution of the Provident Fund. So there are overlapping provisions in various acts that you have to be mindful of. On the one hand, law permits you to make deductions, etc., reductions in salaries, earnings to a certain degree. On the other hand, the Provident Fund Act says if you do so, you are going to prosecute in court. So this is the balance that you need to strike. So my advice has been always to reduce or make the contributions of the Provident Fund in terms of the existing basic salary or the earnings component to pay your Provident Fund, and to reduce or do whatever pay cuts thereafter. Because as a line item, if you reduce earnings and pay or attempt to make contributions based on that reduced component, you are in violation of another set of statutes. I hope that answers your query.
Yeah, no, I think you did, and I think Dinusha made a very important observation about communication. And I know for a lot of companies that's a really difficult challenge at the moment, because you don't have the ability to talk face to face to your employees, because and these are not things that you want to send up do out remotely and so on. So I think the difficulty for companies at the moment is, until life returns back to normal, how does one actually get back to being able to make these communications. Kanishka, Kanishka or Rohan, there was a specific question, sorry, I just scroll down this, about closing, and I'll read the question out because I didn't quite follow it. Kanishka, how do closing orders operate in this type of a situation, and are there any closing orders made? Would you be able to shed, either of you gentlemen be able to shed some light on them? Sorry, Rohan, are you there? It's muted now, Rohan.
Yeah. I'm not aware of whether any closing orders have been, in fact, gazetted, but bear with me, I'll just read out the relevant provisions. So, the closing orders were made as far back as April 1978, when the government decided that certain businesses, such as restaurants, hotels, eating houses, bookstores, etc., bakeries, should have opening and closing times. So it is for that purpose that the closing orders were gazetted as far back as 1976. To the best of my knowledge, in view of this present crisis we are faced with, I am not aware of any closing orders being published.
Rohan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Did you?
Okay, fine. Yeah,
response?
sorry, no, that's clear. I think that's clear. So again, in terms of, I think we've already answered this, but somebody's asked the question. If a company just doesn't have the cash to pay salaries, other than in violation of the law, I'm guessing the answer to that is yes, you are, because your contract of employment is that you have to pay a salary, and if you don't, you are technically in violation of that law.
Yohan, I did an article and shared it with AmCham some time back. I believe, Rai, that is available for the participants to have a look at this session. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. I've shared the link on the chat options, so anyone can take a look at it, and we're more than happy to email it across as well.
So that essentially discusses all the burning issues as at this date in respect of the short-term issues that all employers are faced with. I think if you can have a look at that, that will give an answer a lot of your questions in respect of what employers can and can't do in a strict interpretation of the law.
Rohan, on the EPF, there's a slide. I differ with one point, and this is I had to actually explain because greater number of employers have also asked us on this. I do agree that there are overlapping factors about not being able to reduce the EPF, ETF, but that's on a subsisting contract. Remember, that's on a subsisting contract. Now, if I renegotiate the contract with you and agree to a reduction of your basic salary for EPF, ETF, then the EPF is payable on the reduced salary and not on the the earlier contract, because the earlier contract is for whatever period or whatever it is, it will be on that point it will be rescinded. So the new points there would be earnings, because section 47 says you only pay EPF, ETF on earnings, and provisions, but we need to understand in the context. Here is a special situation where we are actually renegotiating a term, a material term, no doubt. But once concurrence is there, sorry, I think my network seems to be a bit, I changed the network, but it's not working.
We can hear you, Kanishka, that's fine. Carry on.
Okay, so this is something that people, because I also saw a panelist saying, look, you have to pay EPF on the earlier salary, which is wrong. Because I'll be very honest with you, because if you keep paying the earlier EPF, ETF, and the person's salary is reduced, there is a liability for you to make up what you deducted at the end of the day. You see, because you are paying EPF at a notional figure, and that means you have to make up the difference between of the salary and pay according to the law. You have to then because you are saying that okay, his actual earnings are these. I may have come to an understanding at home, but his actual earnings are these. But the correct would be, once you renew the contract, to indicate to the employee that this is the salary after deduction is this, and your EPF is also payable on this, because that actually supports the legal or the legal provisions support that position. I would say. So don't pay EPF, ETF on any notional figure. If it's a higher figure, then you have to actually make up. Someday you're liable to make up for the salary, the difference. So that's why we say once the contract is revised, that's the new salary. Pay EPF on the EPF, ETF on the new salary. Thank you.
Thanks for that clarification.
Thanks all. I think in the interest of time, we are going to have to wind this up. I know the questions are on the chat, and we have the ability. So Rai, you undertake to come back to them. I think one other one which we'll just throw in the middle of the works here to just complicate life a little bit more, and we'll leave that as our last one. I think in the situation where Parliament is dissolved at the moment, and we've talked a lot about the role of the government in stepping in to help find a solution, whether it's suspension of laws or whatever. But in the current situation of a suspended Parliament, is that actually within the legal remit of the government to be able to do that if the desire was there? Rohan, maybe you can give us a view.
Well, technically speaking, Parliament must sit in order to pass any statutes. The Cabinet of Ministers are still in operation, and the Minister of Labour, being a part of the Cabinet, I believe can and is empowered to pass certain regulations, even on a temporary basis. This is subject to correction because we get into a whole new realm of the do's and don'ts in terms of constitutional law. There is a school of thought that the whole Parliament is now back in session because the 3 months have passed, etc., etc. Various schools of thought on that issue as well. So without getting into that, my personal opinion would be that the minister is empowered under special consideration as a part of a cabinet to take decisive action at this juncture.
Right, I'm going to hand it back to you because I'm conscious that we're now coming up to the 12 o'clock mark. So do you want to pick it up from here and wind it through?
Sure. So thanks, Yohan, for doing a great job at moderating our session. And thank you to all our panelists. I think it was a very, very insightful session. We've had quite a lot of questions come up. Most of them we were able to answer. There's about, I think, 10 questions from my last count that we weren't able to get to directly. The reason for that is that they require somewhat longer and somewhat more detailed answers. So our panelists will very kindly, I hope, agree to take a look at them and email the responses into us, which we will share with you. So don't fret if we didn't get to your question. We will get to it. We definitely answered most of the most burning issues and the most important ones. I think overall, both in terms, I mean, looking at the comments and the polling that we've received, it's been a topic that has been very well received, and you know, all the insights that were shared have been really important and really made quite a difference. So thank you once more to our panelists. I know it's, you know, although we say work from home, we were talking about this earlier. We actually seem to have a lot more going on. So I'm grateful to you on behalf of AmCham that you've taken the time off to share with us and share with all our viewers this insight. Thank you to all of our viewers, both here on the Zoom platform as well as on the Facebook Live platform. Your participation, your questions will always make this a more valued session. Don't forget, at the end of the session, we have a little survey form that will come up to you So do fill that in. It will give us more insights into what content to bring you next that will help you. And, as we're all working together to try and get through this, not just conundrum, but this whole situation, I think it takes a lot of, as they say, no man is an island. So it takes all of us to work together to come through this. And I'm grateful for all of your support. Next week, we'll be talking about cyber vulnerability and digital hygiene. So keep an eye on our bulletin board for details on that. The likelihood is that will be next Tuesday. So just keep an eye on the bulletin board. We'll send out the details on that. Thank you to our partner, Cemex HRM, for this support in bringing this webinar to you. And of course, once again, our usual reminder from the AmCham team, stay safe, stay healthy, stay home. Thank you to all of you again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.